Welcome to another episode of Laws and Sausage TV, where we take you inside the political process, bypassing all the partisan jargon, and show you exactly how the sausage is made on the inside of government. By now, you've probably heard that the U.S. is going through an opioid crisis. How do we get there? What can we do about it? Joining me today is expert and CEO of Odyssey House of Louisiana, as well as Vice President of the Treatment Communities of America, Ed Carlson. Ed, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
So, Ed, you've been directing Odyssey House for the past almost 14 years. Tell us a little bit about what you do there.
So I'm the CEO of Odyssey House. I'm responsible for day-to-day operations. When I took over Odyssey House in January 2005, we were only treating about 61 people a month. Today, we treat over 900 people a month, and we literally have waiting lists for all of our programs.
So, Ed, one of the things that you've told me recently was that when you, just a couple of years ago, the heroin addictions were just a small part of your population at Odyssey House, and now they make up over half of your population at Odyssey House. I'm sure directly attributed to the opioid crisis.
Yeah, so that we do. It's very interesting because, as we talked a little bit earlier, sort of the heroin epidemic seems to ebb and flow. Odyssey House, when it was originally created in the 1970s, was because there was this huge rise in heroin use and problems with heroin addiction, and that's how a lot of the drug treatment programs that are around today actually sort of grew. And it was sort of like, unfortunately, kind of like a perfect storm sort of happened all at the same time. That sort of caused a lot of the problems with how the epidemic sort of developed. One of the issues we had was we had a lot of deregulation specifically around use of opioids. And the pharmaceutical industries actually came out and decided that they had claimed that they had produced non-addictive opioid-related products, which actually was a lie. And so, just to be frank. And so there's now a national lawsuit. All 50 states are involved, as well as substance treatment organizations like Odyssey House and a few others that are all suing the pharmaceutical industry because the groups that were specifically lying about this.
So, Ed, you are vice president of a national group called Treatment Communities of America.
Yep.
A lot of organizations like Odyssey House all across America who treat people with substance abuse. The President Trump, when he first got inaugurated, one of the first things he did was created a national opioid commission. Governor Christie of New Jersey was in charge of it. And the government, like all things, is slow to formulate a plan. The lack of a coherent plan, you had mentioned, is one of the problems. But state by state, how is each state handling its own plan?
So a lot of states are struggling with this about how to develop a plan. Louisiana is one of them. There's probably about 90% of the states do not have an official plan on how to deal with the opioid epidemic. And unfortunately, Louisiana is one of those states. So part of what we're trying to focus on, not only Odyssey House or all of the different programs, because Treatment Communities of America represents 600 treatment programs nationally. So every single state, we're focusing on trying to get the states to deal with the opioid epidemic and to develop a plan. And so the plan would actually involve three things. You need three things to solve this epidemic. The first thing you need is prevention. We have to prevent people from becoming addicted in the first place. Because the problem is if you can't stop the flow of people coming in, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. The next thing we need to be able to do is have an intervention. We need to intervene with people who are identified as having an addiction issue. So somebody winds up at the hospital because they overdosed, that person needs to be identified and targeted and then moved to the third thing, which is treatment. And we need to have treatment and treatment services available. And that becomes the most important part. If you can put those three things in place, we will be able to stop and deal with the opioid epidemic.
So you talked about how heroin and opioids as a trend has ebbed and flowed probably for the last 100 years or more. But it seems like it really exploded onto the scene. And I know that there are synthetic forms of heroin like fentanyl, which, misuse and misdosage is causing a lot of these overdoses. Let's talk a little bit about why this surge came on and created a full-blown epidemic.
So like I mentioned, so there was sort of a couple things that all happened at once. One was all of a sudden they stopped the deregulation, and then there was a big push by the pharmaceutical industries to help get more people using opioids. As just as an example, like last year I had a root canal, And a friend of mine who's a dentist, I went in to go see him to get my root canal taken care of, and it was going to be a week or so before they could actually do the root canal. So he gives me a prescription for an opioid-based product, and he gave me 90 days worth. And I was like, my friend, are you trying to make me a client at Odyssey House? Because basically, he gave me enough that I could actually become addicted. And he was following what the pharmaceutical representatives had recommended in terms of what they should be giving out. So we had that problem. The second problem was that you had the illegal market of heroin that had actually gone down quite a bit because a lot of the heroin comes from Afghanistan. And so what happened was during the Afghan war, heroin production dropped dramatically because the US military was in there. While they were there moving around, they were also getting rid of the opioid poppy fields. Well, as the United States moved out, part of what wound up happening is the drug lords all started, or the local warlords all started to go back to their business again. And there were another thing that had happened was during that time period when they had dropped, a synthetic form of opioid had been developed called fentanyl. And that synthetic form of opioid is very good, can be used very well in the medical field, but out in the outside field, people don't understand the dangers and the harm of it. And the problem with fentanyl is that it's being mixed with cocaine, it's being mixed in pill form, and people think they're taking like ecstasy or they're snorting cocaine, and they wind up overdosing and dying because the drug is so heavy and so strong.
So yeah, and we've seen the emergency rooms across the country just being packed with overdoses, and unfortunately the morgues are packed with victims of overdose as well. You talked about treatment and prevention. Anytime you're talking about those kind of services or programs, there's always going to be funding attached.
Right.
What are we doing now to make sure that the proper funding is following these programs?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of movement on the federal level, but stuff hasn't trickled down to us. So like we don't see a lot of funding coming down to help to support us on the treatment end. And we also don't see much organized on the prevention end. What we do see is we see a lot of stuff going on with like having naloxone or other drugs available to EMTs, et cetera, to be able to save people right away, which makes sense. I'm totally for that. I think that if somebody has overdosed, being able to give them a shot or injection, what will wind up happening right away is that person will be able to live. But we're not using that moment to intervene with the person. We're just slapping them on the back saying, hey, you made it, and we send them back out, and they're going to start using again.
So I know that there is some federal legislation that is making a move to kind of separate drug treatment from mental health services, where it's been kind of married together for the last half century.
It's more like shackled together.
Right,
so,
right.
Because the crazy thing, when you want to talk about like laws and sausages and the craziness of how government
So we talk about here.
I know, it's funny that's what you talk about.
Yeah.
So what happens is that sometimes a great intention becomes the worst thing. So back in 1968, when they were creating Medicaid, one of the things they wanted to do is they wanted to eliminate the warehousing of people who are mentally ill. So what they did was they put an inclusion in there that said that Medicaid will only pay for services for community-based programs that only have 16 beds, and they have all these long lists of organizational structures that they have to go to. And it became known as the IMD exclusion. Well, back in 1968, drug treatment programs didn't really exist. Like I talked about in the 1970s, we had this surge and epidemic of opioid use. And so what winds up happening is drug treatment programs, we start to come along, and we go to try to bill under Medicaid, and one of the things that we find out is that we can't because of this IMD exclusion. So the federal government actually created other funding sources through HRSA, through SAMHSA, Center for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, to create block grant funding to help pay for addiction treatment services because of the IMD exclusion. Now you fast forward to the future, and all of a sudden you have, the Affordable Care Act, or known as Obamacare. We have the expansion of Medicaid going all over the place, and states wanting to save money, they want to try to use that money to pay for addiction treatment services. What they wind up doing is if they do that, let's say like Odyssey House, we have 127 beds. In order for us to bill for Medicaid, we'd have to drop to 16 beds, which would make the problem that we have even worse, because we already have waiting lists for all of our residential programs. So here we're trying to, so this IMD exclusionary piece is crazy. And then, because the government can't regulate us enough. One of the things they decide to do, somehow arbitrarily, the Center for Medicaid Services decides IMDs can only provide a minimum of 15 days per month. So it means you can do 15 days in September, come back and do 15 days in October.
As we all know, people addicted to drugs are real good at keeping appointments.
Exactly.
Coming back on
right.
the day they're supposed
That's right.
to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what they're doing is they're taking a mental health stabilization model and applying it to substance abuse treatment services.
So basically the thought process of marrying mental health and substance abuse that was created back in the 60s, it just never evolved.
No, it never did. And
Yeah.
I think part of the issue is there has been a big movement in Congress because literally Treatment Communities of America has been working on this issue for 40 years. And finally, we just got a little bit of traction. So now, I mean, when the President of the United States talks about IMD exclusion, I mean, you can remember times, where we're going in to talk to representatives, we have to start all over from the beginning. Back in 1968, the IMD, but now you walk in,
we call the elevator pitch.
The elevator pitch,
elevator
yes,
pitch.
absolutely. So now we go in and we go to talk about the IMD exclusion, we start to give background. I know the background. And then we can actually really have a good conversation because people are like up to speed on what's going on. Congressman Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania has introduced a bill to it's a very simple bill. It's like 1.5 pages. It takes substance abuse treatment services out of the IMD exclusion, and that would solve our problem.
So we're already through the first quarter of 2018, Ed. Looking ahead to the rest of 2018, what are the main goals and objectives for TCA and everybody working on the front lines like you to battle the opioid crisis?
Well, I think the big thing is to get states to focus on having a plan. Mm-hmm. The second thing is then we're going to focus on trying to get money to the providers down to the bottom so we can start to use it. And to make sure those plans include prevention, intervention, and treatment. And that there's a beginning of implementation of all that.
Right. Well, Ed, it's been very informative. And looking at the opioid crisis itself, like so many things, the government doesn't start paying attention to it until it starts affecting certain communities. And this is one of those issues that started getting into affluent communities as well as low-income communities. And as you see, that made the government act. We want to thank Ed Carlson for being a guest here on Laws and Sausage TV. Come back again and give us an update later.
Anytime.
All right, well, that does it for another edition of Laws and Sausage TV. Thanks for watching, and please check Facebook and LinkedIn for updates. Leave your comments below, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and again, thanks for joining us. See you next time.